Welcome everyone to the Pandemic Addiction Volcano webinar with Dr. Kevin Alderson. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Zena Kraft. I am the marketing manager for counseling at Sage Publications. I also cover social work and anthropology as well, and I'm the marketing manager for counseling, which is what we're focusing on here today. We also have on the line with us Abby Rickard, who is the acquisitions editor for the counseling list here at Sage Publications. And we also have with us on the line our marketing associate, Dylan Scampiano, here at Sage as well. We would like to welcome you all to this webinar. We'd like to also ask that you make sure that you are aware of where the chat box is. Should be to the top right on your screen. We will be utilizing that chat feature throughout this session. You will be able to send questions or comments that we will periodically read off to Kevin to respond. So we'll spend time addressing those questions with the audience, but please also, if you have a Twitter, you may feel free to use our Twitter account at #SageTalks as well. But again, for the most part, our questions will be directed through Kevin. Abby and I will be the moderators for this call, and we will direct your questions and comments and input to Kevin throughout this session. So I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Kevin G. Alderson from the University of Calgary in Canada. Kevin is a professor emeritus of counseling psychology. He has been a counselor for 40 years and a registered psychologist since 1986. He is serving a 3-year term as president-elect, president and past president, respectively, of the College of Alberta Psychologists. That's the body that regulates psychology in Alberta, Canada. Dr. Alderson is a professional member of the Association of Addiction Professionals and currently sits on the editorial board for the Journal of Alcoholism, Drug Abuse, and Substance Dependence and the Austin Journal of Drug Abuse and Addiction. He also holds membership in the American Counseling Association, the American Psychological Association, the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association, and the Canadian Psychological Association. Since 2008, Dr. Alderson has been the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Counseling and Psychotherapy, which is the only national peer-reviewed journal in the counseling and psychotherapy field in Canada. He currently works half-time for the Yorkville University as their director for a proposed online Doctor of Counseling and Psychotherapy degree program. Dr. Alderson has authored 9 previous books and several scholarly articles and books and chapters. He completed a MSc in clinical school and community psychology from the University of Calgary and a PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Alberta. Dr. Alderson is married and is the father of 2 adult children. Outside of counseling, he enjoys racket sports, dancing, hiking, camping, and weight training. And I will add that he is the author of a new textbook, Counseling Addictions Today, that publishes in December through Sage Publications. And with that, I will hand things over to Kevin.
Well, thank you very much, Zena, for that lovely introduction. There is a gift that's going to be sent to each of you if you don't already have this gift. That is, Don Meichenbaum sent me a 186-page book that he wrote, and he intends it to be for free distribution. It's a self-help book regarding addictions. For those of you who don't know Dr. Meichenbaum, he is one of the 10 most famous psychologists, living psychologists in the world today, according to American Psychologist. And he also is one of the founders of cognitive behavior therapy. So I think you're going to find this to be a really helpful resource. And he is asking for donations to the Melissa Institute, for which he has been involved for 20+ years. Anyways, you'll find that, I think, to be quite exciting. So I titled my webinar, The Pandemic Addiction Volcano. I want you to imagine that a disaster has happened and it's basically killed every man, woman, and child in Albuquerque or Baltimore. And that is how many people are dying each year in the United States from substance addictions. Can you imagine? In total, that's 638,237 people. That's the total I came out with. That's a lot of people. Now that includes from smoking. That also includes those who are dying from alcohol, but other drugs are included as well in that. That in 2017, 70,237 Americans died of overdoses. 49,000 of those were opioid deaths. And that represented, by the way, a 10% increase from just a year ago, from 2016. We don't have the stats yet. I don't have the stats yet, at least from 2018. 49,000 opioid deaths. To really put this in perspective, I think we ought to look at how many Americans died in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, as you know, was a 20-year war that ended in 1975. And in total, 58,220 Americans lost their lives in that war. And of that number, 47,000 have been directly attributed to losing life in battle. So in other words, more people died in 2017 from opioid overdoses than soldiers killed in action over a 20-year Vietnam War. And I wish it stopped there, folks, but this only begins the disaster story. The towering inferno caused by an erupting volcano in nearly every country worldwide. This disaster of unnecessary deaths is only a fraction of how addiction is maiming the United States and most of the free world. Dr. Patrick Carnes, who is the most noted authority on sex addiction, said that addiction is taking our children, and soon it will take us. Look around, everybody. How many addicts or near addicts do you already know? How many of you are looking at it yourself daily, or seeing it in a close family member? Once we add in the behavioral addictions, which are sometimes called process addictions, and we add in other behavioral excesses that are maiming our families, our children, and possibly ourselves right now, we have a rate of addiction and addictive behaviors that some researchers and scientists are saying represents half of the American adult population in a given year. This is what I call the pandemic addictions volcano, and its lava has already erupted everywhere. The statistics are frightening. So let's get right to my slides. I begin my textbook with these lines, and it's not an easy thing to admit. This is the textbook that almost didn't happen. I received the contract to write this book from Sage in January 2013. And just as I was beginning to feel momentum internally to get started, knowing what I was going to be in for, my spouse left me in March of 2013. And the next day, I phoned up a trusted friend and I said, would you happen to have a joint? That didn't sound like much of a request. Instead, he gave me a small ball of cannabis, and the next year and a half, quite frankly, is a bit of a blur. That I smoked cannabis morning, noon, and night, like I had done actually several times earlier in my life and at different junctures in my life, never really putting together how much for me this kind of cannabis use was really associated with depression. And once depression had set in, it would lead to serious sleep problems. How serious, you might wonder? Well, I seemed to completely lose the ability to sleep when I stopped my addiction, when I stopped smoking cannabis, and that happened again, as it's happened at least 2 other times in my life. And all the antidepressants in the world do not touch this depression or this sleep dysfunction. And then over time, anxiety is released. And over months of not sleeping much at all, many nights not at all, I end up really ill. So I was hospitalized this past time. I was in hospital for 2 months. And at my worst, I remember them giving me 11 pills at night to help me sleep. 11 pills. They would sit there and watch me take them all. And then I would sleep for 2 hours and wake up. And as time went by, I became increasingly paranoid to the point where at one point my psychiatrist said, you now are at a point where we can force you to take ECT, electroshock therapy. I don't know about you, but since watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I've been kind of scared of electroshock therapy. And I was scared then. And maybe those words is what it took for me to start making the road back to recovery, because within a week, the doctor said, we can no longer force that on you. And I was truly relieved. So then when I got out of hospital after 2 months, I barricaded my office here at home, the very office I'm sitting in right now, put in a mattress, brought in all the weapons I could. Now in Canada, we don't get guns, but if I'd had guns, I surely would have had them in this room. I would have had them back then. But instead, I had pepper spray, I had a baseball bat, I had knives. I was ready because I was still paranoid. This is from cannabis. I can't tell you how strong some of the cannabis is, but every time I saw my dealer, I asked for the strongest she had, and she indeed delivered. I do wonder in retrospect whether sometimes it was laced with stuff, because you can't tell. You know, we think we're getting something that's pure and organic, but it's buyer beware when you're dealing with an illegal market. And so it's very scary anyways, and it's what gave me the grounding to realize addiction is so real when it's in your own life, when you see it around you. And as I started writing the textbook for each addiction I wrote about, I know someone that has that addiction. That was equally frightening. And as I talk about some of these different addictions, I want you to ask yourself the same question. Do you know someone who happens to be that kind of an addict? Do you know someone, maybe that someone is yourself, or maybe it's someone in your family? It doesn't matter either way. It's truly scary. So here's some of the stats that I had just mentioned. You know, I was in Savannah, Georgia back in about 1988. Their population, as you can see here, is about 145,000. So imagine 4 times the population of Savannah being wiped out in 1 year. And that's what's happening with this addiction crisis. Same thing is happening in Canada, by the way. Same thing is happening in one of our capital cities. In Canada, by the way, we only have 10 provinces and we have 3 large territories. But New Brunswick is one of our provinces. And the comparable stat here would be the capital city, Fredericton, being wiped out in a year. That's how many deaths we're having. And the opioid deaths in Canada, same thing is happening in America, is increasing every year right now. So we're not winning this war. You know, the war on drugs that Nixon began, that war is being lost. It's not working. The amount of drug business that's happening in the United States is so scary. that right now, would you believe this, that those who are addicted are spending $100 billion a year, giving this money mostly to Mexico and south of Mexico. We're feeding these drug dealers, but there would be no market if we didn't have addicts that were buying all of these drugs. But over a 10-year period, that means Americans are spending $1 trillion on illegal substances. That is just truly frightening. And here's some other deaths. So I do have the number of opioid overdoses in 2018, 68,000 deaths. So that's an increase from 2017. Remember, 49,000 opioid deaths in 2017. Well, from 49,000 to 68,000, oh my God, this frightens me at every level. And globally, we lost over 500,000 people to drug overdoses in 2017. You can see how the pandemic is increasing. And even the Global Drug Report 2019 has reported that the United Nations even realizes the problem is far worse than any of their statistics had predicted earlier. And here's something really sad out of NIDA's report called Monitoring the Future, that current conditions are ripe for a second relapse phase in drug use among youth and adolescents in the United States. And so the times are such that we can have a real resurgence, because there has been more or less over the years a gradual reduction in most of the drug use, with the exception of a few like marijuana. Marijuana use is, as you might expect, at an all-time high, with it being legal in several American states and being legal for medicinal purposes and still more, and being fully legalized throughout Canada. And is this in Canada? Is it putting the drug lords here out of business? It's not. It's not working. People are still going to their drug dealers because they can get better stuff. They can get better stuff than the stuff that's being regulated and sold through with government controls in place. They can get stronger stuff from their dealers. So the solution to this problem is going to be substantial. And I fear that it's the same as climate change, that we can make small changes, but are these changes going to be enough? Because the changes required, which I can speak to if we have time, are substantial. What I hate about the definitions of addictions you're going to find, almost regardless of the source, that they tend to have their own theory embedded within their definitions of addiction. So for example, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, taking very much a medical biological model, refers to addiction as a chronic disease. So right away, it's saying that it is a disease. And there are choice models as well. There's the biopsychosocial model. But each model of addiction, each theory of addiction is advancing their own definition. So I tried to create a definition which was based on a researcher by the last name of Heather, 2017. She wrote about the problem of definition of addictions. So my definition follows hers fairly closely, and it doesn't really suggest what the cause is behind that. So I use this definition in the textbook. So what are the most common substance addictions? Well, number one, as you might not be surprised, is a nicotine addiction. And nicotine addiction, right now, about 30% of Americans use tobacco products, and about half of those are nicotine dependent. What's amazing about nicotine, by the way, is that only 10 drops of pure nicotine, 10 drops or more, are lethal. If those 10 drops are placed on your tongue, you're dead. You're just dead. It really frightens me, the popularity of vaping. It's happening in both our countries. and the popularity with young people has increased, so they're still getting their nicotine. And as you know, recently in the news, a few people are even dying because of lung infections that are somehow being caused by the use of these vaping devices. But one can vape, of course, with any substance, just about, and vaping with both nicotine and cannabis are quite common. Alcohol addiction, you know, the 12-month prevalence of alcohol addiction is about 8.5%. And if we look at the lifetime prevalence, which means that you've been addicted at some point in your lifespan to alcohol, is actually up as high as 20%. We look at cannabis, and the best stats that I have right now suggest that between 9% and 17% of users are going to become addicted to cannabis. It's the most commonly abused drug in the United States and Europe. And we continue this, and we can move into painkillers in fourth place. What's scary about painkillers is recognizing that while Americans make up less than 5% of the world's population, they consume nearly 1/3 of the global opioid supply. The American Psychological Association has recently released some guidelines and some helpful psychological methods that are really helpful for pain management. Cocaine addiction, you know, in 2016, the highest lifetime and past year prevalence rate for cocaine use was adults aged 26 years and older, and the prevalence was 16.6% for lifetime use and 1.3% for past prevalence. Heroin, it's estimated that 23% of individuals who use heroin develop opioid addiction. Next one is the benzodiazepines. And the benzodiazepines, well, this is scary, that the percentage of American adults filling these prescriptions increased 67% between 1996 and 2013. So from 8.1 million to 13 million users. And this stat is from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Stimulant addiction. So the highest prevalence, lifetime and prevalence rate for the past year for meth use in the United States was for those aged 26 and older, and it was 6.4%, and past year prevalence 0.6%. And I'm not going to go into all of these rates because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. But let's continue. There's really 10 sedatives and barbiturates. You'd think that they've pretty much disappeared because we've known for a long time how great the danger is for overdose, but they're still used medicinally for migraines, cluster headaches, and epilepsy. And then finally, in 10th place, whoops. No, I guess we're now moving into the percentage of the population with substance addictions. So here we are at 14.8 million individuals with alcohol use disorder in the United States, 8.1 million. So in total, about 20.3 million. So 7.4% of the population. And here's the population of the United States as of yesterday, by the way, for anyone who's interested, 329,000, nearly 330 million, 329 million, nearly 330 million. In Canada, our population has exceeded 37 million, so we're a little less than 10% of the size population-wise. So as I wrote here, substance addictions is only the first chapter of the American addiction story. When we add in now the behavioral addictions, some have estimated, like Patrick Carnes and Sussman, Leisha, and Griffiths, 2011, some have said that the 12-month prevalence rate is 47%. 47% of American adults are addicted to something right now, and figures from Canada are comparable. Now, sometimes I think these stats can't be right. And I think what they are talking about, by the way, is more what I'd call behavioral excesses. And that's what Thig, Hodgkins, and Wild referred to these as. But 12-month prevalence, 47% of our populations are struggling with some kind of excessive behavior. And in my textbook, I write about the common behavioral addictions, and I give them a chapter each to themselves, each standalone chapter, so that if you're a student or whether you're in practice or a professor, it doesn't matter, you're going to find this textbook gives you everything you need about that addiction in the chapter in which it's found. Okay, so that's going to be really helpful. But there's a controversy around these behavioral addictions. First of all, are they primary or are they secondary disorders? You know, is it possible that sex addiction can be explained by having obsessive compulsive disorder, for example? And in my own practice, I've had very few clients who I would say, or what I would call a true sex addict, that often they've been involved in drugs that are stimulating their sex drive and also affecting their judgment. Secondly, what is the exact nature of these behavioral addictions? When there's not a consistency and diagnostic agreement, you get some prevalence rates that are sometimes just truly remarkable, and it's because we don't really know until it's decided whether these are even primary disorders themselves. As probably most of you know, in DSM, the only behavioral addiction that's fully recognized by the American Psychiatric Association is gambling disorder. A third part of the controversy is how much is enough before we should call something an addiction? You know, there's lots of young people right now that are gaming an extraordinary number of hours, but does that mean we should call those addictions, or should we call them simply a behavioral excess? You know, our next door neighbor where I live, you know, I didn't see this 21-year-old once this summer, but I heard his screaming and hollering and hooting from his bedroom, and his parents told me they were really concerned about his use of gaming disorder. So gaming disorder is now recognized by the World Health Organization, right? It's in the ICD system of disease classification. And how do you classify disorders that overlap? And we know right now that polyaddictions, we could call them, but having more than one addiction at the same time is becoming, if it's not already, normative. And so regardless of what we call them, the fact is in clinical practice, we're seeing people with these disorders and they are causing problems. And while the exact nature of internet addiction, for example, is controversial, that researchers agree on one thing: it's becoming a bigger problem globally, and especially lots of research is being done in Southeast Asia, where they're aware that there could be 3 million young people addicted to the internet. Some people in Japan will, and probably elsewhere too, will stay in their basements and they only come out to use the washroom and possibly to grab a meal, and you don't see these young people other than that. And they have a Japanese word for that, which escapes me right now. But what do counselors bring to the table? What do we offer that's different than what other mental health professionals and what physicians are bringing? I mean, clearly, to help people with addictions, a team approach is recommended, and let's bring in as many professionals to help people begin to rebuild their lives, or in some cases to build a life in the first place. Well, we act as models for our clients, you know, so if we have our own personal work to do, well, we know we need to do that work so that we can model. And if you've suffered from your own addiction issue, then be sure that you've got that in check as you're working with clients who may be in fact experiencing that same addiction. One of the things that really sets counseling apart from especially clinical psychology is we take a strengths-based approach, and which is nice because clinical psychology, which I have a background in, is really about assessing, diagnosing, and finding people's weakness, and let's accentuate that. In counseling, we work from the other perspective of working on people's strengths. Most of us are wounded healers ourselves, and so long as we're no longer bleeding from those psychological wounds, we have a lot to offer people, regardless of what our age is. I know young counselors often struggle with the credibility question, and it is hard to know, what is it really like to live as an addict if you haven't gone through that? What is it really like on a day-to-day basis to actually have something that's controlling you more than you're controlling it? But you'll garner a lot of credibility with clients if you're honest and real. Be real with clients, man, they appreciate that. It's the number one driving principle in my practice is authenticity. Because we're also helping others remove their facades. We're helping them become real. And to help them stop their outright lying. And if there's one group of people that are experts in lying, it's addicts. Addicts lie, lie, lie. I remember all the times that I lied, and I've taken a vow to never tell another lie if I can help it. And our humility. You know, most of us counselors are pretty humble people. We're a great group to get together with at conferences because we really do like people. It's so refreshing. And also be aware that this is something we bring to the table, that we can offer early intervention. We don't have to wait for people to lose everything. You know, that notion that I think mostly the 12-step programs were promoting or pushing was that you got to hit rock bottom. Well, some people seem to, but you don't have to hit rock bottom if people come and see one of us. And something that is perhaps most important of all is that type of existential enlightenment. The medical profession, they do great work, but the focus is generally on medical solution, of course. And so we help clients focus on the more existential questions. You know, what is the meaning of our life? I keep remembering Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he talked about the people that survived in the concentration camps and those who did not. And such an important piece that kept some alive was their sense of meaning and purpose, that there was meaning in their suffering. Maybe we can help addicts see that even there's meaning, that their shame and guilt, which can be overwhelming, particularly when they stop using, can actually lead them to relapse. And so we can help them see that there is meaning in their suffering. So a final reflection I'd like to offer is that the potential for human growth that can be imagined can also be realized. Also, I wanted to offer a few more free resources. If you've stuck with me this long, then let me throw a few other good things at you. So my history form, which I've noted several times in the textbook, anyone can use it. And you know, I spent 30 years working on this history form, and it takes clients about 45 minutes generally to complete. I have them get it to me before my first session with them, and you'll see there's an interesting pie chart you can use. And if you go to my website, which is right there, and just go under resources, you're going to see the personal functioning questionnaire for an instant download. And also there's the Canadian supplement if you are interested in truly the situation that's occurring here in Canada. So the APA, they have a publication called Monitor on Psychology. And so in their June issue, they wrote about these assessment devices. There are websites you can get these for free, so you can find them really good, really fast, I should say. The Screener and Opioid Assessment for Patients in Pain, revised. The Current Opioid Misuse Measure, and I strongly recommend free download, the Opioid Guide, a resource guide for practicing psychologists, because it's not about whether you're a psychologist or not. It's about how are we going to help people in the best ways possible. So hopefully you're going to find these helpful. In my textbook, I have lots of measures that counselors can use, most of them available online. And what I searched for was the ones that the clients can do online, and it gives them a score instantly and gives you a score instantly. So with some of my clients, I'll have them sit in my office and start by completing these measures, 1 or 2 measures, and that gives me a sense of really where to begin with them. Also, in terms of protecting ourselves legally, it's good to have some instruments that we use that have bona fide psychometric properties. In other words, that have established reliability and validity. So I truly focused on presenting most of those, and a few that are a little not as psychometrically sound. So, for example, I have a chapter on romantic relationship addiction, what some writers have called love addiction. And according to some writers, again, it's a very common thing, and perhaps it's the type of addiction that many of us have had when a relationship hasn't worked out and ended, and the pain that created, and sometimes the desire to stalk that person. So maybe love addiction is real, but we don't know that yet. All we know is people are hurting out there, and that's where we come in as counselors. And then I just follow this up with some of the resources I've used in putting together this presentation. Mate, Gabor Mate, he's traveling around the world sharing his work with drug addicts in Vancouver, Canada. Frontline physician is what Gabor was working as, and now he's spreading his work with people and how he's helped them. But he is convinced that all addictions are rooted in childhood maltreatment, in trauma, even to be more specific. And man, oh man, he's unbending in that. I spent a day with him in a group kind of presentation he gave for the entire day. He's interesting to listen to, but it's just not based on research. That a lot of addicts, yes, they have had traumatic childhoods and bad things have happened to them, but others have come to addiction through many different pathways, some through having a very impulsive personality. So it's no surprise that those with ADHD are much more prone not only to addiction, but to many mental health problems. And some are risk takers. They're seeking excitement. I remember a young man of about 32, and he had a perfect family from my observation, from his accounts, talking to his parents, and alcoholism was ruling his life when I first started seeing him. But he was a partier, and at one point he was into all kinds of heavy drugs, and his addiction really fell mostly into alcoholism. And another married man who traveled a lot for his work, a guy with an MBA, great training. And yet when he was away, he would organize these wild, incredible parties where every drug, I think, on earth was being consumed by the people there, and until he started doing some sexual indiscretions, and the guilt and remorse, thankfully, was there something to work with. So there's many pathways to addiction, but truly trauma is a really big pathway that cannot be understated or denied. And that's about it for my presentation today, and I would be happy to entertain questions until our time is up.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was awesome. If anyone has questions or comments or inputs, whether about love addiction or childhood trauma connect as a pathway to addiction or ADHD questions, please feel free to pose that question in the panel. It should be to your right, and you can collapse the arrow for either chat or questions, and we can take your questions there, and we'd be very delighted to receive them and have Kevin answer them via the webinar. Abby, how about you? Do you have any questions?
Yeah, Dr. Alderson, I was wondering if you could speak to cultural differences, since you yourself are from Canada, based in Canada, but you also are very affiliated with a number of American organizations. And we know through, studying psychology that there are different perceptions of addiction and mental health in different cultures. Do you address that at all in your work or in your textbook?
In every chapter, chapters 9 through 21, I do look at some of the particularly cultural differences as they apply to ethnic, diversity, but I also cover differences that we know about the LGBTQ community, for example, and so I do cover that, and also one of the theories of addiction, the sociocultural theory. Really focuses a lot on those cultural differences. I found it incredible, by the way. I just returned actually on a cruise. I went to several cities in Greece and several cities in Italy, but I already knew that Italy has actually a very low alcoholism rate, whereas you look at France and they have a very high alcoholism rate. And the differences appear to be mostly cultural. That in Italy, it's appropriate to drink wine with meals, but not to get drunk and not to drink as a general rule of thumb. Whereas in France, it's a bit more like I'd say Canada is, which is drink, 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 because it can be very boring to live in some of these northern climates, especially with our long winters. And so in France, in consequence of this cultural difference, that drinking is okay in any social situation, and it's also okay. Public drunkenness is tolerated. That this is what the cultural theorists would say explain the difference. When we look at differences between Canada and the United States, I think one of the first differences is the fact that your population is 10 times greater than ours. It means people are generally living in closer proximity to one another. And in some of the larger cities, of course, that you've got people living in high rises. And so how do you maintain privacy? I remember living in a high rise myself, and people rarely said hi to each other in the elevator. And it was one of the ways of almost pretending that you're on the elevator alone. So I think that that's a huge difference. And in terms of, liberal political views and conservative political views, that's constantly fluctuating in Canada as it has in the United States. So I'd say the biggest difference is the fact that you have 10 times our population.
And then we have 2 questions from Kenneth Brown and 1 comment from Jennifer. I will read the 2 from Kenneth. The first one is an easy one. It's, are there assessments available based on childhood trauma and addictive behaviors?
Now, there certainly are instruments regarding simply, childhood maltreatment of all kinds, childhood trauma. Or whether there's one that also is looking at childhood trauma combined with addictions, nothing is leaping out in my mind right now. What I have found interesting is in that one questionnaire, the SOAP-R, is which is really a measure looking at what's the likelihood if you're on taking pain medications that you're going to end up abusing those medications, that the questions, none of them have to do with physical pain. They're all about psychological trauma and psychological pain in the present that people are going through. So, you know, I know two opioid individuals who were on opioids and they became addicted to them, but neither one of them had suffered this childhood trauma. And when their physical ailments were relieved, they were able to get weaned off. And so most of these people that we see on the street suffering from heroin addiction, it's not because of physical pain that they're there. They're really numbing their psychological pain. So sorry, I don't think I went off on a tangent there, but I don't know of an instrument that looks at both. But my God, there's so many psychological instruments available to us. You'll probably find one or more.
And then Kenneth also stated, as a drug counselor in rural America, opioids and methamphetamines are a huge epidemic. Are you able to speak to this?
Yeah, well, you know, it also speaks to the question of what do we do about this huge problem? It's like, you know, we start to make progress, it seems, with one addiction. In other words, that fewer people are using a particular drug. And then we get a rise in some other addiction, whether it's behavioral or substance. I just finished reading a book called The Second Mountain, just came out in 2019 by a well-known American journalist. And, you know, he made a couple of points in terms of, you know, the problem with gun violence and so forth. That part of the problem is not just the breakdown of the family unit, but it's also that people don't have enough connection to others in their lives. That neighborhoods used to be places where you would know one another. And there was often a woman who might have been like a matron who kind of watched out for what was going on in the neighborhood. But these close connections that people had helped insulate them from addiction. And so the problem in rural communities is that isolation that can occur. So I think what we need to do is promote stronger community connection, as well as use of the many support groups that are available online that are ideal for people that are isolated in their addiction, for example. So most of the 12-step programs, for example, do have online meetings, and many of the behavioral addictions have online meetings as well. So sexaholics, sex addicts, anonymous, and so forth will have online meetings. So I would encourage develop strong community support and make use of internet support groups.
Okay, I hope we've answered your questions. And then Jennifer has a comment. She says, as a teacher myself, I try to use person-first language and really stress that to students. I would hope that you are also working on shifting to non-stigmatizing language. Words like addict should really be shifted to person with a substance abuse disorder.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that, Jennifer. I do speak to that. You know, that we've had a shift in psychology and counseling away from language that, especially language nouns, use of nouns. So the addict is a noun, and instead moving more to adjectives even. And as you probably know, well, you may not know because you're a school teacher, but DSM took out the word addict completely because of its stigmatizing, aspects to it. What's interesting is, you know, in labeling theory, that there are both pros and cons to labeling, as especially I think psychiatrists and physicians are aware. One of the pros of calling oneself an addict is the awareness that it's something that we have to recognize, that we're in recovery and we never fully get there, that the underlying dynamics that created our addiction in the first place are resolvable up to a point, but only up to a point. There doesn't seem to be any good solution to early childhood trauma, for example. And in fact, other than in my textbook calling myself an addict, I use addict as an adjective, and most of the time I don't use it at all. And I do refer to DSM languaging of calling such problems as disorders. So that's a good point. So there certainly is that shift. And I remember hearing reading a book by Albert Ellis, where he was talking about he himself was moving into E prime writing, where you get rid of the verb to be. So it's not I am a psychologist, I'm a person who practices psychology. So I do take your point.
Great. Yes, point well taken. And then Jennifer also asked if we would receive copies of your slides.
I'm certainly open to making that available. So Zena, if I send you, well, you have the slides.
Yeah,
Would you make that available to the audience?
I absolutely will. Do we have any other questions before we close out? Well, I certainly, on behalf of Kevin, Abby, Dylan, myself, our Sage Talks webinar, would like to thank everyone for attending. I would just like to point out that, in fact, yes, we will be sending you a link to this webinar as a follow-up. You will also receive a certificate of participation. You will also receive, as Kevin so gratefully just made available, the PowerPoints for you as well as the free book that he referenced in the presentation. We will make all of those available to you here soon in the next few days, so please be on the lookout for those as well. Kevin has also put together a few lecture PowerPoint slides that are infographics that are quite engaging for students, and be on the lookout for emails. Those will be sent out in separate emails as they'll go to a larger audience, and I'll make sure that you guys are on that list so that you receive those. But they are, and Kevin, I don't know if you want to speak to those, but these are PowerPoints that Kevin has graciously created for teaching the course and kind of putting into context some of the statistics, so they're in the form of infographics.
I don't think I can offer too much more to say on that, other than the infographics do include some of the stats too that I've been talking about through the webinar. I also want to thank each one of you personally for taking part today.
Well, with that, we will go ahead and close out. Let me just make sure there are no more questions. Well, Christine Slattery just said, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you.
And Isaac Karakari said he'd be looking forward to receiving those resources.
I think you'll find them very, very helpful, and do pull off those resources from my own website. I think you'll find the history question